The first United Nations High-Level Conference of Heads of Counter-Terrorism Agencies of Member States is taking place this week at the UN, precisely on June 28th and 29th. The overarching theme for the conference is strengthening international cooperation in order to combat the evolving threat of terrorism. The conference aims to build a new partnership for multilateral cooperation to strengthen the international community's counterterrorism efforts. In this context of action, among the important things that are highlighted in this conference that could be very beneficial to the work of my NGO, I will speak about the topic of mobilizing international cooperation to combat the evolving threat of terrorism. There is also a topic about the opportunities and challenges in strengthening international cooperation through the sharing of information, expertise, and resources. Then the issue of combating the evolving threat from foreign terrorist fighters. I've been exposing that in past videos. And the issue of strengthening global action to prevent violent extremism, including by engaging youth and preventing misuse of new technologies and the internet by terrorists. Also, the topic that is covering the strengthening rule and capacity of the United Nations to support member states to implement the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy. As we know, there has been a report that has been published this year on April, basically for the establishment of a global strategy of counterterrorism by the United Nations. But there is also a lot of other things that could be spoken about in this context of action. Big set of themes such as countering the financing of terrorism and the challenges in identifying, monitoring, and countering the financing of terrorist groups and individuals, preventing incitement of violence and violent extremism, protection of critical infrastructures against terrorist attacks in the context of implementation of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2341 of 2017, standing in solidarity for the rights of victims of terrorism. And then the thing that I want to also see during these 2 days is the launch of a new research that examines women's realities as victims and perpetrators and preventers of violent extremism. There is also a topic about the lawful access to digital data across borders and database for counterterrorism competent national authorities, as well as international cooperation framework to combat the use of the internet for terrorist purposes in terms of opportunities and challenges. Among the other things that could be discussed within these 2 days, I have in mind the rehabilitation and reintegration of foreign terrorist fighters and violent extremist offenders, the human rights and civil society engagement as foundations for effectively preventing violent extremism and counterterrorism, the implementation of global aviation security plan in light of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2309 of 2016, youth as protagonists in preventing violent extremism, and the highlights about the United Nations compendium of good practices on the protection of critical infrastructures against terrorist attacks, how to counter and prevent violent extremism through communications and empowerment of strategies involving youth, leveraging partnerships and strengthening cooperation with women to counter and prevent violent extremism and terrorism in several parts in the world, and taking it case by case. Human rights compliant responses to the threats posed by foreign fighters. Countering the foreign terrorist fighters in this context of action is a phenomenon and it has to involve the combined efforts of police and justice. Among the other things to be discussed during the high level meeting, I do believe it's very important to speak about disrupting terrorist travel by the implementation of the passenger name record, the PNR, and the Advanced Passenger Information, the API, as well as the requirements of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2396. Harnessing the power of empowerment and peace, and the power of quality education and preventing violent extremism are, of course, things that has to be also part of this framework. Preventing violent extremism through national action plans by supporting a whole of a society response to violent extremism must be also spoken about by the member states. The issue of foreign terrorist fighters in terms of prosecution, rehabilitation, and reintegration, the recommended practices are to be brought to the table during this high-level meeting in terms of responsible use of sharing of biometrics and identifying terrorists, addressing the challenge of foreign terrorist fighters at a global and national level, and also the human security and youth leadership to approach and prevent violent extremism. Very important for the international community to speak about all these topics during the high level conference. So, among the things that I want to bring here a little bit highlighted, I think very important to speak about the efforts that are made between the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, the OCT, with the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, the UNODC, that works, of course, in consultation with the Counter-Terrorism Executive Director at the CTED in this context of action. Among the very important thing to highlight is the international cooperation and information sharing to combat the use of the internet for terrorist purposes, comparing extremist messages and promoting tolerance on social media platforms, and finally the role of the private sector in combating the use of the internet for terrorist purposes. If I want to go a little bit on detail in regards of some important topics that has to be spoken about during these 2 days, I want to get back to the United Nations Compendium of Good Practices on the Protection of Critical Infrastructure Against Terrorist Attacks. Within the high-level conference, it's very important to speak about the topic because terrorists have targeted critical infrastructure including energy, transportation, water supply, tourism, and communication systems, for decades. And these activities represent a considerable security threat to member states and to the international community as a whole. So, measures to protect critical infrastructure can prevent high impact terrorist attacks against targets such as airports, railway stations, dams, and nuclear or chemical plants. The immediate response to a terrorist attack against critical infrastructure can also prevent the cascading effects frequently associated with such attacks. Responding to for the international community to this challenge requires basically a comprehensive understanding to the measures to be developed and implemented to strengthen the security and protection of particularly vulnerable targets, including in the area of civil protection. So the other thing that I want to go in detail about here is also the recommended practices for the responsible use of sharing biometrics in counterterrorism. Foreign terrorist fighters and their travel continue to represent a considerable security threat for the international community, detecting the cross border movements of returning and relocating foreign terrorist fighters and their families from the conflict zones of Iraq and the Syrian Arab Republic, in example, is a considerable challenge for member states, border management, and security agencies as well. Some FTFs are expected to continue their movements towards other conflict areas, such as in Yemen, while others will attempt to regain countries of origin, and it is essential to prevent them from creating and leading cells to recruit, radicalize, and conduct terrorist attacks. So, responding to this challenge requires a comprehensive understanding of border management issues and tools, including the responsible use, collection, storage, and sharing of biometrics in counterterrorism. The Security Council stresses in its Resolution 2396 of 2017 that the use of biometrics will help member states detect and identify FTFs. Thank you.